Ricky Collins was born in the South Bronx on a February morning in 1978, when the neighborhood still carried the scars of the fires that had consumed entire blocks a decade before. His mother, Diane, worked double shifts at Mount Sinai Hospital, her hands perpetually smelling of disinfectant and exhaustion. His father was a name on a birth certificate, nothing more. Ricky grew up in a three-room apartment on East 149th Street, where the radiator clanked through winter nights and summer brought the smell of hot asphalt and overflowing dumpsters through windows that never quite closed properly. From an early age, Ricky understood he was different, not in ways he could articulate at 7 or 8 years old, but in the way his body moved, the way his voice carried a softness that other boys mocked, the way his eyes lingered on his male teachers instead of the girls in his class. The South Bronx in the mid-1980s was not a place that made room for difference. Survival meant fitting into one of the accepted molds, tough, masculine, ready to fight at any perceived disrespect. Ricky fit none of these. The schoolyard became a daily gauntlet. He learned to walk quickly, to avoid eye contact, to disappear into himself. His teachers saw a quiet boy who kept his head down and turned in assignments late. They didn't see the way he was shoved into lockers, the way his lunch was knocked from his hands, the slurs that followed him like a second shadow. Faggot, punk, sissy, words that landed like fists, leaving bruises that never showed. By 13, Ricky had stopped going to school regularly. Diane was too exhausted to notice, or perhaps she noticed and didn't know what to do about it. The neighborhood offered no sanctuary. The church where his grandmother took him on Sundays preached love but practiced exclusion. The community centers were run by men who believed in discipline administered through leather belts and closed fists. Home was supposed to be safe, but even there, Ricky felt the weight of disappointment in his mother's eyes, the unspoken question, why can't you just be normal? He found refuge in the margins. There was a small park near Yankee Stadium where other outcasts gathered after dark. Gay men, mostly older, some trans women who had been pushed out of their families and into the streets. They taught Ricky the language of survival, how to read danger in a man's posture, how to make yourself small, or how to make yourself intimidating depending on the situation, where to go when the police decided to clear the park for the 10th time that month. They also taught him about desire, about the possibility of being wanted instead of despised. It was a dangerous education, but it was the only one available. At 15, Ricky met Marcus. Marcus was 19, built like an athlete, with a smile that could disarm and a temper that could erupt without warning. He sold weed on the corner of 149th and Grand Concourse, and he told Ricky he didn't care that he was gay. For 6 months, Ricky believed him. Marcus would show up at the apartment when Diane was working nights, bringing Chinese food and cheap wine. They would sit on the fire escape, and Marcus would talk about his plans to get out of the Bronx, to open a barbershop in Atlanta or maybe Charlotte, somewhere warm where people didn't know his past. Then one night Marcus brought 3 of his friends. They were drunk, loud, testing boundaries. One of them made a joke about Ricky, something crude and sexual. Marcus laughed. The sound of that laugh, the ease of his betrayal, cut deeper than anything that came after. They held Ricky down, and Marcus watched. When it was over, Marcus threw 2 $20 bills on the bed and told Ricky not to tell anyone, or he'd make sure everyone knew what kind of person he really was. As if they didn't already know, as if Ricky had any power left to lose. Ricky didn't report it. Who would he tell? The police who routinely harassed people like him in the park, the school counselor who had once told him that maybe if he acted more like a man, the other kids would leave him alone, his mother, who was barely holding herself together. Instead, he swallowed the shame and the rage, let it settle into his bones like a chronic illness, and learned to navigate the world with that weight. The streets of the South Bronx in the mid-1990s were carved into territories more intricate than any map could show. There were the physical boundaries, which blocks belonged to which crews, where you could walk safely depending on your age, your color, your affiliations, but there were also invisible territories, spaces where certain kinds of people were tolerated or targeted. Ricky existed in the overlaps, the no man's lands where official society had given up and unofficial society hadn't quite decided what to do with him. He started working at 16, off the books, at a bodega on Westchester Avenue. The owner, an elderly Dominican man named Felix, asked no questions and paid in cash every Friday. Ricky swept floors, stocked shelves, served customers who ranged from hurried nurses grabbing coffee before shifts to dealers restocking their candy and chip supplies. He learned to read the rhythm of the neighborhood, to sense when tension was building, to know which customers would pay and which would take and which would cause trouble that wasn't worth the $10 in the register. Felix had a nephew, Daniel, who started hanging around the bodega that summer. Daniel was different from the other men Ricky had known. He was quiet, worked construction, came in after his shifts covered in concrete dust and plaster. He treated Ricky with a casual kindness that felt revolutionary. No expectations, no demands, no violence lurking beneath small talk. They began spending time together outside the bodega. Daniel would bring coffee from the good place on 3rd Avenue, the one that ground its own beans. They would sit on the bench outside St. Jerome's Church and watch the neighborhood move around them. Daniel was the first person who told Ricky he didn't have to hide, that being a gay man didn't make him less worthy of respect, less deserving of safety, less human. It was a radical concept in a place where survival often meant erasing parts of yourself. For 8 months Ricky allowed himself to believe it might be true. They made plans. Daniel was saving money, wanted to move to Hell's Kitchen, where there were more people like them, where holding hands on the street didn't guarantee violence. Ricky started setting aside his own money, dreaming of an apartment with working heat and windows that locked properly. Then came the night that changed everything. Daniel was walking home from a late shift, cutting through St. Mary's Park to save time. 3 men followed him from the Cypress Avenue entrance. They shouted the familiar slurs, demanded to know why he was walking through their neighborhood, looking the way he looked. Daniel tried to de-escalate, tried to walk away. They beat him so severely that the first officer on scene initially thought he'd been hit by a car. His skull was fractured in 2 places, his jaw was broken, he lost vision in his left eye, and 4 teeth. The attackers were never identified. The police report described it as a mugging gone wrong, despite the fact that Daniel's wallet and phone were still in his pockets when paramedics found him. The detective assigned to the case, a man named Richardson with dead eyes and a permanent scowl, interviewed Ricky once. His questions focused on whether Daniel had been dealing drugs, whether he'd owed money, whether there was some rational explanation for such violence. When Ricky mentioned that Daniel was gay and that this might have been a hate crime, Richardson's expression didn't change. He said the South Bronx was a dangerous place, that people got hurt for all kinds of reasons, and that sometimes bad things happen to good people. Case closed. File it under unsolved assault. Let it gather dust with 1,000 others. Ricky visited Daniel in the hospital every day for 2 weeks. Daniel's family blamed Ricky for what happened, said their son had been fine until he started spending time with people like him. They had him removed from the visitors list. The last time Ricky saw Daniel, his face was still swollen, his words slurred around broken teeth. He told Ricky he was going back to Puerto Rico to live with his grandmother, that he couldn't stay in a place that had tried to kill him for existing. Ricky understood. He also understood that something fundamental had shifted inside him, that the part of him that had learned to stay quiet and invisible was dying, and something harder was taking its place. Pause and reflect when justice stops at the gates. Who dares to cross? The South Bronx stretched from the Harlem River to the Bronx River, from 138th Street up past Fordham Road, a patchwork of neighborhoods, each with its own character and code. Hunts Point, where the prostitutes and the produce market coexisted in uneasy proximity. Mott Haven, gentrifying block by block, old-timers pushed out by rising rents. Melrose, where the Grand Concourse still held echoes of its Art Deco glory, beneath layers of grime and neglect. And throughout it all, the projects Patterson houses, Millbrook houses, St. Mary's Park houses, towers of brick and concrete, where generations of families lived, layered on top of each other. Privacy, a luxury no one could afford. Ricky knew every corner of this territory. After Daniel left, he began walking at night, tracing the paths where violence happened to people like him. He started carrying a small notebook, documenting incidents the way the police never would. A trans woman beaten outside the 3rd Avenue bus shelter. Police report listed it as assault, no hate crime investigation. A gay teenager thrown down a flight of stairs in his own building. Police report said he'd been drunk, accident. A drag performer robbed at knife point after a show in Manhattan, chased into the Bronx. Police report taken, no follow-up. The pattern was clear. Certain people were considered disposable, their suffering unremarkable, their deaths unsurprising. Felix noticed the change in Ricky. The quiet young man who'd kept his head down was gone, replaced by someone harder, more observant, carrying himself differently through the bodega's aisles. One evening after closing, Felix poured 2 glasses of Brugal rum and told Ricky a story about his own youth in Santo Domingo, about a corrupt police captain who'd terrorized his neighborhood, about the morning they'd found the captain's body behind the church, with a single note pinned to his chest. God sees what the law ignores. Felix didn't elaborate on who they were, or whether justice had been served. He just said that sometimes the world creates spaces where official morality stops functioning, and people have to make difficult choices about what comes next. Ricky started paying attention to the men who terrorized his community, the dealers who beat their girlfriends in public, knowing no one would call the police, the landlords who let buildings rot while collecting rent from families with nowhere else to go, the gang members who recruited children as young as 11, offering protection that was really just another form of exploitation, and especially the men who hurt people like Ricky, who attacked gay men and trans women for entertainment, who believed their victims were too afraid or too marginalized to fight back. There was a man named Tommy Rodriguez, who ran a crew out of a social club on Southern Boulevard. Tommy was 43, built like a refrigerator, with a reputation for generosity to his friends and cruelty to everyone else. He had a particular hatred for gay men, made jokes about cleaning up the neighborhood, made a sport out of identifying and humiliating anyone he perceived as weak or different. He'd been arrested twice for assault, walked both times, because his victims didn't show up to testify. Fear was its own kind of power. One Thursday in October, Tommy left his social club around 2 in the morning, drunk and loud, celebrating something. He walked north on Southern Boulevard, past the closed bodegas and the all-night laundromats, toward his apartment building on Westchester Avenue. The street was empty except for a few late-shift workers and a homeless man sleeping in a doorway. Tommy never made it home. The next morning, someone found him in the alley behind the laundromat, unconscious, with a message written on the wall above him in spray paint: "The neighborhood sees you." No one witnessed anything. No cameras covered that particular stretch of alley. Tommy survived but was hospitalized for 3 days. When he was released, he told police he'd been jumped by multiple attackers, but his description was vague, contradictory. The investigating officers seemed uninterested. Tommy Rodriguez was known to them, his sheet long, his victims numerous. If someone had decided to send him a message, well, these things happened. The code of the street. Nothing to do with official justice. The spray-painted message stayed on the wall for 2 weeks before the building owner painted over it. But by then, people had seen it. Photographs had been taken. The phrase began appearing in other places, other contexts. A landlord who'd been accused of cutting heat to force out rent-stabilized tenants found it painted on his car. A store owner who'd been caught selling expired baby formula to WIC customers found it on his storefront gate. Always the same message: the neighborhood sees you. No violence, just exposure. A reminder that someone was watching, that impunity had limits. Ricky continued working at the bodega, continued walking the streets at night, continued filling his notebook, but now he also carried spray paint in his backpack and a baseball bat wrapped in black electrical tape. He never initiated confrontation. He watched, waited, documented, and when opportunities presented themselves, when the men who preyed on the vulnerable made themselves vulnerable, he acted, not with rage, not with cruelty, but with a cold precision that was more frightening than any display of emotion. The second incident involved a man named Hector Vega, a bouncer at a club in Hunts Point, who had a side business robbing gay men he met through dating services. Hector would arrange to meet someone, usually in a public place, to build trust, then suggest moving to a more private location. Once isolated, he would threaten his victims with violence or exposure, taking money, jewelry, phones, anything of value. It was a perfect crime. His victims were often closeted, afraid to report what had happened, ashamed of how they'd been victimized. But Ricky heard about it. One of Hector's victims worked as a nurse at the same hospital as Ricky's mother. The nurse told a friend, the friend told someone else, and eventually the story reached Ricky through the informal network of gay men who shared information about dangerous people and places. Ricky began following Hector, learning his patterns, documenting his crimes. He watched Hector meet a young man outside a diner on Bruckner Boulevard, watched them talk and laugh, watched Hector suggest they go somewhere quieter. Ricky followed them to an abandoned building near the expressway. What happened in that building, Ricky never spoke about in detail, but Hector Vega stopped working as a bouncer. He moved out of the Bronx within a month, told people he was going to Florida to help his sick mother. Before he left, a message appeared on the wall of the club where he'd worked: "The neighborhood protects its own." The gay community understood what it meant. So did others who preyed on vulnerable people. A new equation was forming. Impunity had consequences, even if the law didn't provide them. If you're watching this because you believe in stories that challenge official narratives, stories that document what happens in the spaces where traditional justice fails, then subscribe to this channel. There are more untold truths waiting to be revealed, more voices that deserve to be heard. Stay with us as this story unfolds. The legend began to spread through the neighborhood in whispers and rumors. Some people said it was a vigilante group, ex-military, or ex-cops who'd gotten tired of watching criminals walk free. Others said it was gang-related, a new crew marking territory. The truth was simpler and stranger. It was a 20-year-old gay man with a notebook and a sense of purpose, forged from years of abuse and erasure. Ricky didn't think of himself as a hero. He thought of himself as someone doing necessary work in a system that had failed people like him so completely that direct action was the only response left. The third incident changed everything. There was a man named Luis Martinez who ran a grocery store on Prospect Avenue. Luis was respected in the community, served on the local community board, donated to youth programs. He was also molesting his teenage employees in the stockroom, using his position and their family's economic vulnerability to ensure their silence. When one girl finally told her mother, the mother confronted Luis. He threatened to have her deported, to call immigration on the entire family. The girl stopped coming to work. Luis hired another teenager to replace her. Ricky learned about this through his mother, who knew the girl's aunt. At first he wasn't sure what to do. This was different from targeting violent men in alleys. Luis Martinez was visible, established, protected by a network of business relationships and community ties. Exposing him would require evidence, corroboration, a willingness from victims to come forward. But the system that should facilitate that process had already failed. The girl's mother had called police, filed a report. An officer came to the store, talked to Luis for 15 minutes, left without interviewing the girl. Case noted, no action taken. Ricky began documenting Luis Martinez's patterns, his interactions with young employees, the times when the stockroom door stayed closed longer than reasonable. He also started talking to other people in the neighborhood, asking careful questions. How many teenagers had worked at that store over the past 5 years? How many had quit suddenly? What reasons had they given? A picture emerged of serial abuse, of a man who had learned exactly how to exploit the marginalized immigrants, people without legal status, families too afraid of deportation to seek help. One Saturday night, Luis was closing his store alone. The last customer left around 9. Luis locked the front door, began counting the register. Ricky entered through the back, the door that employees used for deliveries. He didn't bring violence. He brought a camera and a list of names, girls who had worked for Luis and disappeared. He told Luis he was going to the police, to the newspapers, to the community board. Luis laughed. He said no one would believe a gay man over an established business owner, that Ricky had no proof, that he should leave before Luis called the police himself. Ricky didn't argue. He left the store, walked to a payphone 2 blocks away, and made 5 phone calls. To the mothers of girls who had worked for Luis, to a reporter at the Daily News who had covered other abuse cases, to a victim's advocate he'd met through the LGBTQ Center in Manhattan, and to a detective in the Special Victims Unit who, unlike Detective Richardson, actually cared about justice. By Monday morning, Luis Martinez was being investigated. By Wednesday, 2 more victims had come forward. By Friday, Luis had closed his store and hired a lawyer. The case never went to trial. Luis pleaded out to lesser charges, got probation and mandatory counseling. It was an imperfect outcome, but it was something. More importantly, it sent a message even established community members could be held accountable if someone was willing to push. The neighborhood noticed. The spray-painted messages stopped appearing for a few weeks, replaced by a different kind of communication. People started leaving notes at the bodega where Ricky worked, anonymous tips about other abusers, other criminals, other situations where official justice had failed. Ricky's notebook filled with names and addresses and stories of harm. Pause and reflect. When the system protects predators, when fear silences victims, when does silence become complicity? The South Bronx community was not monolithic. It contained multitudes, working families trying to build better lives for their children, elderly people who'd lived through the neighborhood's worst years and survived, artists and activists working to transform the community from within, and yes, also criminals, predators, people whose response to systemic poverty and racism was to exploit those even more vulnerable than themselves. The challenge was navigating these overlapping worlds, understanding that justice was never simple, that every action rippled outward in ways that couldn't always be predicted or controlled. Ricky's work attracted attention from multiple directions. Some people saw him as a protector, someone willing to stand up for those the system ignored. These were mostly people from marginalized communities: gay men, trans women, immigrants, sex workers, anyone who existed in the spaces where police protection was theoretical at best. They brought him information, asked for help, treated him with a deference that made Ricky uncomfortable. He didn't want to be seen as a leader or a savior. He just wanted to address specific harms, to create accountability where none existed. But others saw him as a threat. There were men in the neighborhood whose power depended on fear, on the belief that they could act with impunity. Every time Ricky confronted someone, every time a message appeared on a wall, that illusion of invincibility cracked a little more. Some of these men began looking for whoever was behind the messages, asking questions, offering rewards for information. The social club crews, the dealers, the legitimate businessmen with illegitimate side businesses, they all wanted to know who was challenging their authority. There was a woman named Maria Santos, who ran a community organization out of a church basement on Brook Avenue. Maria had lived in the South Bronx for 40 years,
raised 5 children there, buried 2 of them to street violence. She knew everyone, saw everything, and had a reputation as someone who could solve problems that official channels couldn't touch. When Maria asked to meet with Ricky, he understood it was not an optional request. They met on a Tuesday evening in a small park near the Bronx Zoo, away from the usual territories. Maria was in her 60s, short and solid, with eyes that missed nothing. She told Ricky she knew what he was doing, that she understood why, that she even respected it. But she also warned him that he was playing a dangerous game, that the men he was confronting had resources and connections he might not anticipate, that his protection was temporary and contingent on his usefulness to the community. More importantly, she told him about collateral damage, about how violence and exposure never stayed contained, about how every action he took affected people beyond his intended targets. Ricky listened. He respected Maria too much to dismiss her concerns, but he also knew that doing nothing had its own costs, that every day he didn't act was another day someone suffered preventable harm. They didn't resolve their differences that evening, but they established a line of communication. Maria became an informal advisor, someone Ricky could consult before taking action, someone who understood both the necessity and the danger of what he was doing. The 4th incident proved Maria's warnings prescient. There was a landlord named Robert Chen, who owned several buildings in Melrose, all of them barely habitable, all of them filled with families who had nowhere else to go. Chen would let violations pile up, ignore court orders, then offer tenants a choice: move out voluntarily or face eviction proceedings that would destroy their credit and make finding new housing nearly impossible. He'd been sued multiple times, always settled, never changed his practices. The buildings continued to deteriorate, while Chen collected rent and waited for the neighborhood to gentrify enough that he could sell to developers. One of Chen's buildings had a particularly dangerous problem. The boiler was cracked, leaking carbon monoxide into first-floor apartments. Tenants had complained to the city, to housing court, to their council member. Inspectors came, issued violations, set deadlines for repairs. Chen ignored them all, paid the nominal fines, continued collecting rent. It was the middle of winter. The first-floor apartments were cold because residents couldn't use their heat without risking poisoning. Children were getting sick. Elderly people were suffering. Identifying the attackers took 2 months of careful work. They were brothers, Joshua and Kevin Martinez, both with prior arrests for assault. They lived in Patterson houses and had a history of targeting gay and transgender people, treating violence as entertainment. Ricky documented everything: their movements, their associates, their patterns. He also discovered that Joshua was on probation for a previous assault, meaning any new crime could send him to prison. Ricky didn't confront them directly. Instead, he sent the footage, along with Angela's medical records and a detailed timeline, to Joshua's probation officer and to the police precinct where the original assault report had been filed. He also sent copies to the local news stations and to several LGBTQ advocacy organizations. The pressure mounted quickly. Advocates demanded investigation. News coverage embarrassed the police department into action. Within 3 weeks, both brothers were arrested. Angela, despite her fear, agreed to testify. The trial took place in the fall of 1999. Ricky sat with Angela in the courtroom, watched her tell her story with dignity and precision, watched the brother's lawyer try to undermine her credibility by focusing on her gender identity rather than the crime. The jury wasn't perfect. This was still a time when trans people were rarely understood or respected, but the evidence was overwhelming. Both brothers were convicted. Joshua received 7 years, Kevin 5. It was justice, imperfect and incomplete, but real. Angela cried when the verdict was read, not just from relief, but from the shock of being believed, of mattering enough that the system actually functioned. She hugged Ricky in the courthouse hallway and told him he'd given her something she'd never had before, the experience of being protected. It was the first time Ricky understood that his work wasn't just about punishment or accountability. It was about demonstrating to marginalized people that they deserved safety, that their lives had value, that someone was willing to fight for them even when official systems failed.